Good evening, friends. Please confirm you can hear me by typing yes. Chaliye, let's chant and then get down to the task at hand. So, this discussion session should last about an hour or so, just to give you a sense of how much time of yours I'll be taking up. Okay, and we can begin our discussion by focusing on the 2025 paper. From this paper, we will be taking up the questions from the topics that we have covered in paper 2 in classes till now, namely caste system, tribes, and family and kinship. All right. So, one question from the question number 1D for 10 marks, compulsory question. How did colonial policies for tribes affected their socio-economic conditions in India? Discuss. I repeat, how did colonial policies for tribes affected their socio-economic conditions in India? Discuss. What do you think should be an appropriate introduction? Now, if you were to blankly go about it, you will do what? You will mechanically define tribes. But that will not be the best introduction. Please try to ensure your introduction is as intimately and directly addressing the question, the demand of the question as possible. Instead of that definition of tribe which Jyoti you are suggesting, a better way will be to talk about colonial policies a bit, because the question, and it's a 10 marker, so the question is largely about the effect of colonial policies on their socio-economic conditions. So in the introduction, we can briefly talk about the colonial policies, or you can share data. Yes, Anakha, as you are suggesting, right? Something on the lines of that the British created the Imperial Forest Service and enacted various laws, various forest laws that adversely affected the autonomy, economy, and culture of several tribes in India. Okay? And then, with this brief introduction, after that, you give a subheading. Effects of colonial policies. I am writing here shorthand, COL. You will be writing the full word, of course. Okay? Effects of colonial policies. The question is regarding the how colonial policies for tribes affected their socio-economic conditions. Right? If you please, you can attempt this question in points form, in para form, whichever way. If you think you have multiple things to say, which can be nicely segregated and presented as separate points, be my guest and write the answer in points form. If you don't have too many things to say and you want to perhaps be a little repetitive, it may be advisable to write in para form. Let us say if we are writing in the points form, what all effects we can mention? We can talk about land alienation. You can mention how various forest acts of 1865, 1875, 78, and so on, enacted by the British, restricted the access of tribals to the forests. So the customary rights that the tribals enjoyed over lands they inhabited for several centuries were disrupted, resulting in increasing landlessness. ठीक? Second, you can talk about socio-economic conditions बोला है, तो social and economic दोनों aspects पे decent amount of emphasis या decent number of points होने चाहिए. Absolutely, Shivansh, we can. Absolutely. Sticking with some economic dimensions, I will say it led to loss of livelihood. So colonial policies basically resulted in a decline in the traditional economic activities of several tribes. Practices like shifting cultivation, hunting, capturing animals, all of these witnessed a significant decline. ठीक है? Kiran, it will not be appropriate to talk about rehabilitation and resettlement because the colonial policy was not so integral to the colonial policy. It was only after independence that developmental policies began having a rehab and resettlement component. Okay. Nextly, we can talk about the introduction of market economy. In tribal areas. So with the introduction of dikkus or outsiders who were typically caste Hindus, who were mostly merchants, traders, and money lenders, all these people were introduced in tribal areas, resulting in a culture of loan taking, indebtedness, increasing incidence of indebtedness amongst the tribes. Anakha is asking for answers where we start with a quote or a definition. Is it mandatory to completely replicate it word by word? The short answer is no. So let us say you are quoting Elvin, that the colonial laws are such that every tribal breaks one law every day of his life, right? When you are expected to quote verbatim, word by word, is when you are saying that, something, if you're writing it in this fashion. One sec. If you're writing it like this, that Verrier Elvin said that, and you're writing something like this. If you're using these quotation marks, then the content has to be a verbatim reproduction, because that is what the quotation marks imply. What you simply do is you do not use quotation marks. So you simply say, Verrier Elvin commented that, blah, 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 blah. The colonial laws were restrictive and impinged upon the tribal way of life. I have paraphrased Elvin and not quoted him verbatim because I don't remember and I don't need to remember. Right? So just don't use the quotation marks, then you paraphrase or you mention their idea. I hope that addresses your question, Anakha. Writing the definition of tribes is okay in the introduction, but it is not the best way to begin writing this answer. Na? Rather give an overall picture talking about some colonial policies, or you say that colonial policies were designed to, for resource extraction and economic exploitation of the forest wealth, resulting in a loss of culture, autonomy, and economic exploitation of the tribes. Something like that. Related to colonial policies. Na? Chaliye, moving ahead where we were. So market economy was introduced, resulting in indebtedness, etc. Do we get extra marks for direct quotations? Possibly not. So don't stress yourself to remember verbatim. Fourth, we can say it led to practices like forced labor. So tribal population were compelled to work in mines, in plantations, coffee and tea plantations, in exploitative conditions. फिर हम आ जाते हैं सोशो इकोनॉमिक कंडीशंस बोला है तो अब सोशल पे आ जाते हैं. No, sorry, 5. We can talk about how colonial policies also resulted in cultural alienation. So the traditional way of life of the tribals was disrupted as there was loss of habitat and loss of livelihood, the traditional livelihood. It also had a corrosive impact on tribal culture. It weakened traditional tribal social institutions. All right. Then we can talk about religious conversion. So Christian missionaries were introduced in many tribal dominated regions to carry on proselytization. Proselytization matlab conversion. So they spread the word of the gospel and encouraged tribals to discard their traditional religious beliefs, practices, and deities and switch to Christianity. Particularly tribes in what were called the frontier provinces, matlab border areas. They were, many of them underwent large-scale conversion. Tribes like Nagas and Mizos, and several big tribes in central India also experienced conversion. Seventhly, it also led to modernization. So due to missionary activities, for example, many tribes were exposed to modern education, modern healthcare, right? Many tribes became conversant in and readily took up English language. All right. So ye sab hua. Nextly, we can talk about criminalization, as Shivansh was mentioning in one of his comments. So the British declared certain tribes under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 and many subsequent pieces of legislation as, entire communities, entire tribes were branded as criminal. Right? For example, communities like Thugs, Minas, Gujjars, and several others. So these people belonging to these communities were seen as, criminality was understood to be somewhat hereditary and habitual. That these are habitual criminals. Inki ek tendency hai to be criminals. So these laws which branded them as criminals also put restrictions on their movements and freedoms. For example, they would require permits and passes to move beyond their, conventional areas where they would be residing. Absolutely, the Chenchu as well. ठीक है. So इस तरह से हम 7-8 चीजें social and economic impacts of colonial rule बता सकते हैं. In the conclusion, now how do we conclude? Acha, one suggestion, any point you are mentioning in one line or two, please briefly explain it. Briefly explain it. Yes, we can write about land revenue system, so many things. We can talk about tribes being cut off from the mainstream. This is not an exhaustive list, right? So tribals were cut off from the national, political, mainstream, and so on and so forth. Many things had happened due to British policies. You can also quote scholars while writing these points, like Walter Fernandez, Virginius Khaka, K.S. Singh, and others. And in the conclusion, what you say? You say, I'll suggest a couple of ways one can conclude. One is that as an expression of tribal discontent fostered by colonial policies, the period of British rule also witnessed numerous tribal rebellions and uprisings. Or another way of concluding that to address these problems, policy initiatives were taken after independence by the national leadership under the tribal Panchil framework. Right? Briefly. But most content has to be about the impact of colonial rule on the socio-economic conditions of the tribes. All right. Next question. What is kinship? Briefly explain. Question number 4C, 10 marks. What is kinship? Family and kinship unit say. Briefly explain G.P. Murdoch's contribution to the study of kinship systems. What is kinship? So in the introduction, rather than defining kinship, because let that come as the first part of the answer, you can talk about the importance of kinship. You can say that family and kinship are important social arrangements in societies across the globe. Various sociologists such as Murdoch and Curvey have made important contributions to our understanding of various types of kinship systems. Then in the next para, you give a subheading kinship. Or you give a subheading what is kinship. And then you explain what it is. That kinship refers to the network of social relationships based on blood, marriage, or adoption. Kinship systems organize individuals into families and communities and assign different roles, obligations, and rights based on one's social location in the kinship system. Okay, something like that. Kin can broadly be of two types, affinal and consanguineal, so on and so forth. And then you explain briefly what affinal kin and consanguineal kin are. Then you give a separate subheading, G.P. Murdoch's contribution, in which you talk about how he conducted a cross-cultural study of different kinship systems. Second, he based it on empirical evidence or undertook a scientific approach to the analysis of kinship systems. Thirdly, he classified kinship systems into different categories like Eskimo, Hawaiian, Crow, and so on and so forth. Fourthly, he talked about various universals that we find across kinship systems. For example, according to G.P. Murdoch, nuclear family is a universal social institution, even in societies where you have seemingly alternative family arrangements like traditional joint families, the nuclear unit is the primary or the basic one. And any other family form is an extension of or a modification of this primary social unit. All right. I repeat, Siri. In GP Murdoch's contribution, you highlight number one, he undertook a cross-cultural study, comparative study of kinship systems. Number two, it was based on, or it used a scientific, Murdoch employed a scientific approach, doing so based on empirical evidence. Thirdly, he classified kinship systems into several types like Omaha, Crow, Eskimo, and Hawaiian. Fourthly, he highlighted several cultural universals which can be found across kinship systems. According to Murdoch, the nuclear family is a universally present social institution. The incest taboo that prohibits sexual relations or marital ties between certain categories of kin, like mother and son, are universal. Sexual division of labor, meaning that certain tasks being assigned to men and certain other tasks being assigned to women, is a cultural universal. All right. Then next point, you can say Murdoch helped us to understand kinship systems, various kinship systems in great depth, as he captured various aspects of different kinship systems, including kinship terminology, marriage rules, rules of inheritance, rules of residence, status within kinship categories or kinship groups, exchange of gifts, and so on and so forth. कंक्लूजन में क्या लिखेंगे? कंक्लूजन में हमें किनशिप की भी बात करनी है, मर्डॉक की भी करनी है. क्वेश्चन क्या था? व्हाट इज किनशिप एंड what are GP Murdoch's contributions to the study of kinship systems? So in the conclusion, we can frame it something like this. While Murdoch's contributions to the study of kinship systems are seminal, for a full understanding of kinship systems, his writings can be complemented with those of various other scholars. Should we also tell about criticisms of Murdoch's theory? It is not required or expected. It's a 10-marker question. You won't have enough space. All right? ठीक है? अगर criticism करना है, you can do so briefly in the conclusion itself. You can do so, but you can't devote too much space to it. You can say, for example, that while Murdoch's contribution to the study of kinship systems is seminal, his frame of reference was largely several, Western societies and American tribal communities. For a better understanding of kinship systems in other societies like India, Murdoch's framework needs to be supplemented by those of other scholars like Iravati Karve. Is criticism a good way for concluding? It is a legitimate way, no doubt. Okay, what is terms of address and terms of reference? Tanishka is asking in Murdoch's classification. Terms of address is how one person addresses another. Term of reference is how you talk about another person to a third person. Okay? For example, in North Indian village communities, you will find that women refer to their husbands as Aji sunte ho. Okay? But when they are talking to another person about their husband, they will refer to him as कि मुन्नी के पापा ये लाए. Right? That is so मुन्नी के पापा here is a term of reference, while Aji sunte ho is a term of address. And the two can also overlap, of course. Can we give criticism in a separate paragraph rather than in conclusion? Absolutely, you can. Just ensure that the flow is not, it should not look abrupt, it should not look odd placed, or it should not disturb the flow of the answer. Okay, thank you, Siri, but I'm not well versed with Telugu, so I cannot appreciate the example. Tappu ke papa in Tarak Mehta, Imandi in Telugu. Question number 6A. In what respects have the constitutional provisions changed the socio-economic and political conditions of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India? Critically examine. I repeat, in what respects have the constitutional, and it's a 20 marker. In what respects have the constitutional provisions changed the socio-economic and political conditions of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India? Critically examine. So what should be the broad structure of this answer? I should be giving a brief introduction in which I have to touch upon constitution, I have to touch upon social, economic and political impact on SCs and STs. सारे मैंने क्वेश्चन से ही ये सारे क्यूज निकाले हैं. Then I will give a subheading, constitutional provisions. I am writing consti, you will write the full word, of course. Then, the question says, I repeat, in what respects have the constitutional provisions changed the socio-economic and political conditions of SCs and STs in India? Critically examine. So, one may, this is a decision we have to take on the spot. One may choose, should I write socio-economic impacts and political impacts separately? I'm choosing not to do that. Why? Because the second part is critically examine. तो हर चीज को मुझे पॉजिटिव और नेगेटिव बताने पड़ेंगे, बहुत ज्यादा सब पार्ट्स हो जाएंगे. इसलिए क्योंकि क्रिटिकली एग्जामिन लिखा है, मैं एक लिखूंगा क्रिटिकल एग्जामिनेशन. कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल प्रोविजंस डिस्कस करने के बाद क्रिटिकल एग्जामिनेशन, जिसमें उसके एक सब हेडिंग होगी पॉजिटिव इंपैक्ट्स एंड एक और जिसमें हम नेगेटिव इंपैक्ट्स डिस्कस करेंगे. रादर देन कॉलिंग देम नेगेटिव इंपैक्ट्स, आई विल से limitations and drawbacks. All right. So this is the broad structure of my answer. And then, of course, a conclusion. Brief introduction, brief conclusion, and the rest. Millie is suggesting in the introduction, can we start with the need for these provisions? Or can we say that several provisions have not been sufficient? The first suggestion you have made, Millie, is correct. We can talk about the need for these provisions, but I will not advise you to go with the second one in introduction, that these provisions have not been sufficient. That is something you can say towards the in the conclusion, right? So first you can talk about the need for special constitutional provisions for SC/STs, then the provisions, and then the critical examination, followed by that they have been not sufficient. So simply, one possible introduction can be that the Indian Constitution has incorporated several specific provisions to address the historical discrimination and continuing prejudices against the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. While these provisions have significantly affected the social, economic, and political life, while these provisions have significantly affected their social, economic, and political life, but they have not addressed their concerns in entirety. Okay, something like that. This is my introduction. Then I talk about various constitutional provisions for SCs and STs. For example, Article 17. Now, mind you, this portion has to be small. This portion has to be small. Why I am discussing it separately? Because it is a 20 marker. So the question provides me space, but the main demand of the question is this: critical examination, right? So we will give much greater space and attention to this portion, much lesser to this portion. Say around half a page or 3/4 of a page to the constitutional provisions, and at the very least 1.5 page to the critical examination part. Mohan is asking, can't we write the provisions and their positive impacts together and the limitations separately? You may do so, but since the question is asking for critical examination, I will not say it is entirely wrong, Mohan, but it somehow appeals more to me if you are giving a subheading critical examination where you are talking about the positive impacts and then the negative or the unfulfilled promises of those constitutional provisions. Okay, Ashish has made a very legitimate question. If we write the articles from the constitution, will it not look like a GS or a polity answer? That's perfectly acceptable. Yeah, it is in sync with the demand of the question. Since the question is from regarding constitutional provisions, it merits a mention of those provisions. So those provisions will not change whether they are being used in a sociology paper or a polity paper or a history paper or a geography or any other paper, political science paper, right? So we mentioned various constitutional provisions. Article 17, which prohibits untouchability. Article 23, that prohibits human trafficking and forced labor. Article 24, which regulates child labor. These two are not specific to SCs and STs, 23 and 24, but they do have a significant impact on these communities because they are particularly vulnerable to exploitation as under human trafficking or child labor. All right. Article 15(4), that the state can make special provisions for advancement of SC/STs. Article 19, clause 5. 19 is various democratic freedoms, but 19 clause 5 says that reasonable restrictions can be imposed on people's movement, etc., for the protection of the interests of scheduled tribes. Then Article 25, subclause 2, clause 2, subclause B, which throws open all places of a public character like Hindu temples, public wells to all Hindus, including SCs. Various other provisions. So you have provisions for reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the constitution. They are given reservation in parliament, in state assemblies, in panchayati raj institutions and municipal bodies, right? Then you have provisions for National Commission for Scheduled Castes, National Commission for Scheduled Tribes. I think it is 338 and 338A. Equal voting rights, all public offices being open, etc. So point is, there are many provisions. You'll have to keep it very, very brief. If you remember at least some of the articles, do mention, don't worry that it will make it GS type, right? That is how you address this particular portion. Then coming to the critical examination of the changes, this portion, the main demand of the question. After writing critical examination, if you can manage space, write a single line that the above constitutional provisions have had a profound impact on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Then give a subheading, positive impacts. In positive impacts, we can talk about creation of a middle class strata amongst the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. We can talk about political mobilization, rising political consciousness and political engagement of various tribes and scheduled castes. We can talk about their increasing participation in modern education, in administration, so greater representation of the historically marginalized communities because of the reservation policy. We can talk about increase in literacy rates, how the literacy rates amongst scheduled castes has increased to 66% and scheduled tribes to 59% as per the 2011 census. We can talk about increasing connectivity, infrastructure development in tribal areas, which has ended their erstwhile isolation, their geographical separateness from the rest of the society. We can talk about increase in avenues for social mobility for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So both are participating in the new economy, leaving their traditional occupations, seeing opportunities for improved income and dignity. We can see that there are regular protests and agitations by Dalits and Adivasis, which indicates that they are challenging the traditional social order, that they are asserting their identity and they are demanding equality. All these we can mention as some of the positive impacts of constitutional provisions. May I continue, friends? I hope the speed is all right. Does it need repetition? Shivansh is saying, can we write points like glass ceiling in private institutions in the limitations? I'll come to the limitations now, nextly. But, the phrase glass ceiling is specifically used in the context of the barriers that women encounter. Do tribals and Dalits also encounter some barriers? Yes, they do. We'll frame it differently rather than calling it a glass ceiling. Okay? Now coming to the limitations and the drawbacks, where we can talk about persistence of prejudices. So Dalits and Adivasis continue to face stereotyping, prejudicial attitudes. I'm repeating the positive impacts again. Emergence of a middle class strata amongst SCs and STs. Before coming to the drawbacks, I'm repeating the positive impacts. Creation of a middle class strata amongst SCs and STs. Rise in literacy rates. Increasing political awareness and mobilization. Increasing representation in higher education and administration. Increasing avenues for social mobility. Infrastructure development, leading to greater integration into the mainstream society. All right. Challenging the traditional social order, asserting equality, demanding equality, asserting their constitutional and legal rights. All of that. Arpita, I hope that suffices. Moving on now to the limitations and drawbacks. They continue to face persistently prejudices, stereotyping, and hostile attitudes. For example, you can quote empty number of studies which indicate how, like we had discussed, Ghansham Shah, Untouchability in Rural India, his book. How in the 21st century, untouchability is rampant in scores of villages. We can talk about discrimination in education, including in modern education systems. We can quote Sukhdev Thorat, who has highlighted how they continue to face absolutely discrimination. We can talk about rise in atrocities that Andre Bete has mentioned, that with increasing empowerment, there are also increase in atrocities against Dalits and Adivasis, because they are not conforming to the traditional social order. We can talk about development deficit, that Dalits and Adivasis are lagging behind on various indicators of human development. There is higher incidence of poverty, illiteracy, landlessness, and so on. We can talk about land alienation amongst the tribals. How after independence, industrialization gathered pace, which further aggravated their alienation from land and their culture. We can quote a Walter Fernandez, a Virginius Khaka, and so on and so forth. We can talk about how the benefits of constitutional provisions have been limited to sections of these communities. So not all Dalits and all Adivasis have benefited, but few have benefited. All of these we can talk about. Shruti is asking, is it necessary to write the name of the book and the scholar's name? Not necessary, but if you remember some, it will definitely add value. Try to remember some scholars' names. If not 4 or 5, mention 1 or 2 at the very least. एक दो जिन्होंने ट्राइबल्स के कोई प्रॉब्लम्स पे बात की हो, दलित्स की प्रॉब्लम्स की बात की हो. So इस तरीके से हम बात कर सकते हैं. कंक्लूजन में something on the lines that while constitutional provisions are important and empowering for Dalits and Adivasis, they alone are not sufficient to address the historical discrimination and contemporary disprivilege that the communities face. ठीक है? चलिए, moving on. Question 6C. Yes, Shivansh, we can mention about displacement milli, we can talk about manual scavenging, still done by scheduled castes, overwhelmingly Tanishka, absolutely. So of course, what the points I've discussed, these are not holistic, right? Chaliye, 6C. Which measures would you suggest for preventing caste conflicts in India? Justify your argument. I repeat, which measures would you suggest for preventing caste conflicts in India? Justify your argument for 10 marks. How will you write the introduction to this question? For God's sake, do not define caste. It will be way off the mark. Way off the mark. Don't take a standard templated kind of an approach. In the introduction, please talk about caste conflicts. So you can say that in modern Indian society, there are caste conflicts on a regular basis. You can talk about the reasons, the factors which are leading to these conflicts, because main body mein to measures aane hain. Due to various factors like competition for limited resources, assertion of dominance, as a backlash against upliftment of the traditionally low-ranking communities, and due to social prejudice. Right? To prevent caste conflicts will require a multi-pronged approach. And then you give a subheading, measures. क्या measures हम suggest कर सकते हैं? Various measures, friends. I'm just doing it in diagram form, but you may write it in points form. Just for ease, I'm doing it. Okay, let me do it now. That 1 sec. I'll use the points form only, since we've begun doing that. Arey. So what measures? One most obvious, friends, is effective implementation of the laws. So laws like SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, constitutional provisions prohibiting untouchability, and so on, need to be effectively implemented. Second, you can talk about how the education system can be galvanized, can be used to impart modern values or modern ideals like equality across castes to the next generation. You can talk about strengthening democratic frameworks. And democratic institutions to deal with any conflicts. So rather than conflicts taking a violent expression, rather than conflicts becoming overt, conflicts can be properly managed and constitutionally resolved if democratic traditions are strong. So how you strengthen democracy, for example, that no caste or community is left out from the democratic space. There is adequate participation from across communities, that there is representation of different social groups in the political system. So they will feel that we can, claim resources through the politico-administrative system. So, no community is excluded, no caste is excluded from political assertion. Right? So political, educational, legal measures. Of course, also economic aspects, friends. Inclusive growth. A high rate of growth and inclusive growth. In other words, friends, if the economy is growing at a sustained pace and the nature of economic growth is inclusive, the economic growth trajectory is inclusive, then various castes will have adequate opportunities. Right? So there will be less chance of scrambling for limited economic opportunities. Right? We can talk about how civil society can play a constructive role in bringing together communities, initiating dialogue for peaceful resolution of any sort of issues between communities. We can talk about creating awareness and sensitization regarding, say, the historical discrimination which certain communities have faced, regarding or spreading constitutional morality premised upon equality, fraternity, and liberty to all sections. For example, this can be done through media campaigns. We can talk about inter-community dialogue. Regular inter-community dialogues, engagement, greater social interaction between different castes, which will reduce prejudices, which will ensure an open channel of communication. Right? So इस तरीके से हम एक आंसर फ्रेम कर सकते हैं. ठीक है? Next question. I'd say it is a little difficultly worded question, but interesting. ऐसा नहीं है आपको पता नहीं है इसका आंसर, बट आप इसको कैसे कंटेंट को हमारी डिस्कशंस में से निकाल के लाएंगे, I want to see. Question 7C. How Dalit movements in India, listen carefully, how Dalit movements in India have facilitated their identity formation. Analyze. Okay, the previous question, caste conflicts wala, what about the conclusion? Can you suggest some conclusion for that question? The previous question was, which measures will you suggest for preventing caste conflicts in India? Justify your argument. How will you conclude it? You can say that as long as caste identity and caste prejudices remain strong, caste conflicts are to be expected in society. However, the forces of modernization will, in the long run, help to reduce the salience of caste in our society and resulting in fewer conflicts in the India of tomorrow. something like that. Ashish is also suggesting overall reforms in Indian society is the way forward. Absolutely. Something like that. You can mention some thinker like Jitesh is suggesting. That's another way. Moving on to the next difficult question. Question 7C. How Dalit movements in India, I'll write this question in fact. How Dalit movements in India have facilitated their identity formation. Question mark, analyze. 10-marker question. Question number 7C, CSE 2025. What is the question about, friends? First, we have to understand the demand of the question properly. It may seem to be about Dalit movements, but it is far more about the Dalit identity. Okay? Or how Dalit movements have led to the formation of the Dalit identity that we see today. So we have to link movements to the Dalit identity. The emphasis is on the Dalit identity formation. That is something very, very important to be understood from the language of the question. हमने अपने डिस्कशंस में बेशक दलित मूवमेंट्स पे फोकस किया है, ठीक है, उसको हमें अपनी नॉलेज को रिफ्रेम करना पड़ेगा टू टॉक अबाउट द फॉर्मेशन ऑफ दलित आइडेंटिटी. ठीक है. So Dalit movements are somewhat of an add-on or a causative factor. The question mainly focuses on the Dalit identity that has been formed. No, Millie, incorrect. So in the introduction, we can say that Dalit movements have been very powerful and sustained movements by the Dalits since Ambedkar's times have aimed to check social discrimination, address historical disprivilege, assert their rights, and reconstruct a new collective identity for the Dalits. Okay? Then you talk about the identity formation. Perhaps in this kind of a question, you may be better served writing it in para form than points form. Okay? As you feel comfortable. But what all aspects, in any case, in a different paras, we have to bring out different aspects of that Dalit identity. So we can talk about how the Dalit identity it is basically based on the idea of dignity and not humiliation. So the Dalit movements have rejected the social stigma traditionally associated with the Dalit identity in the caste system. The Dalit movements, they have, sought to own up the Dalit identity rather than see it as a source of humiliation or, resulting in a sense of inferiority. So Dalits are not seeing themselves as victims. rather as active claimants of respect and dignity in society. For example, the Mahar Satyagraha in Ambedkar's own times, blessed by Ambedkar, or the temple entry movements, whether with the blessings of Ambedkar and or Gandhi, all of these sought to accord dignity and respect to the Dalit identity. Secondly, this new identity is politically assertive, politically active and assertive, rather than being social outcasts as they were in the traditional social order. They, political mobilization of Dalits through movements like the Dalit Panthers Party, through Bahujan Samaj Party, it has sought to ensure that Dalits are increasingly voting actively, that they are influencing election outcomes, that they are influencing policy formation, government formation, right? Thirdly, this Dalit identity is about acceptance of the historical discrimination that has been faced, rather than its denial. Like the word Dalit itself, the term Dalit, which means crushed or broken, was preferred instead of the Gandhian term Harijan. Then this new Dalit identity is based on a rejection of Brahmanical Hinduism and the Brahmanical social order. So one important aspect of the Dalit movement has been conversion to Buddhism. Basically, the Dalits seeking a new collective salvation or a new collective source of spiritual gratification outside of the Hindu fold. Another aspect of the Dalit identity has been to celebrate, to articulate, and to celebrate Dalit history. So many Dalit writers, poets, stand-up comics nowadays, theater, they are putting forth the Dalit worldview, the Dalit culture, the Dalit narrative to effectively counter the upper caste narrative or the upper caste cultural hegemony. Another aspect of the Dalit identity, friends, is that it is constructed as a modern identity, yani not traditional. When I say modern identity, it means what? The Dalits have rejected the Manusmriti or Sanskritic learning as worthy. Rather, they see English language, they see modern education as source of empowerment, rather than continue to work under the Varna Vyavastha and the caste order, the Jajmani system as the lowest of the lot. They prefer the mechanisms of the market economy. Scholars like Chandrabhan Prasad have highlighted how Dalits can benefit. So he's, for example, promoted Dalit capitalism. Okay? Another aspect is it is based on rights rather than patronage. So Dalits are not seeking arms. Dalits are not seeking benevolence of the higher castes. Rather, they are emphasizing upon asserting their constitutional and legal rights. They are demanding access to entry into temples, they are demanding reservation, they are demanding equality, which is their constitutionally guaranteed right. Right? You can talk about scholars like Gail Omveth. Also, you can talk about how this new Dalit identity is increasingly confrontational and assertive rather than being weak and meek. For example, the developments like the Bhim Army in Uttar Pradesh. They are protecting Dalit youth from being beaten up by those belonging to other higher castes in colleges and schools. Or the celebration, of the anniversary of the Bhim Koregaon victory, right? And the subsequent protests which took place. Or the Una uprising, how that was followed by strident protests. Okay? Point is, friends, keep Dalit identity as at the center of your answer. Question Dalit identity pe hai, Dalit movements pe per se nahi hai. How the Dalit movements have led to the formation of the identity, ye hai. Is it clear? Scholars we can mention Zeliot, Gail Omveth, Ambedkar, of course, Suraj Yengde, so many. Conclusion, बताइए. Can we mention music bands like Casteless Collective? Absolutely. Absolutely. Conclusion बताइए. Should we not write the challenges before the Dalits before the conclusion? I think if it's a 10 marker, you may not have adequate space for that, and it is a 10 marker. Okay? Or you can mention challenges or limitations in the conclusion itself, Astik. In the conclusion, we can say something like addressing the, limitations or challenges. We can say one possible conclusion, key, while the Dalit movement has successfully created this new assertive identity, identity formation is only half the battle won, right? To address the historical discrimination and contemporary prejudices that Dalits face will require their sustained socio-political mobilization and educational and economic empowerment. One possible conclusion. Another possible conclusion, while the Dalit movements have made significant progress in the creation of a new Dalit identity, challenges remain. For instance, the continued prevalence of the practice of untouchability within scheduled castes, the great heterogeneity of castes and the benefits of political mobilization, accruing to only some of the bigger Dalit castes, or how Dalit women's problems have not been adequately addressed, and the Dalit movement continues to be largely manned by and controlled by men. So the Dalit female identity remains somewhat subsumed and not fully expressed in this new Dalit identity. कुछ तरह के challenges या limitations हम बोल सकते हैं new identity के, या फिर हम बोल सकते हैं दलित आइडेंटिटी तो फॉर्म हो गई है, which is a great thing, but that alone will not help to achieve the objectives of, or it is only one important step, one important development for the Dalit movement, but its broader agenda of a post-caste or a casteless society will require continued sustained efforts. Okay? So this is, friends, how we could have tackled various questions of 2025 Sociology Optional Paper 2 from the topics of caste, tribes, and family and kinship. Okay, some comments are there. In other subjects, it is suggested to end conclusions on a positive notes. If we write challenges, won't it give a negative impact? Not at all. I will not speak for other subjects, but in sociology, it is perfectly acceptable. It should be in sync with the rest of the answer. It should be linked to the question. It is no compulsion that you have to write in some flowery or positive way the conclusion in sociology answers. Definitely not. Can we have a session on paper 1 PYQs? We can do that, Arpita. Okay. Yes, Mohan, the conclusion you are suggesting, I had suggested something on similar lines. Although the Dalit movement has created a separate or new, more assertive Dalit identity, there are challenges like wide heterogeneity or numerous castes with practice of untouchability. Chaliye. Thank you, friends. I hope you found the session useful. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद. And hope to have more such sessions in the future. Astik, the question you are asking regarding environmental movements, I have not yet taught it to your batch. So we will be discussing environmental movements, then we'll be in a better position to answer that. Okay? Thank you, friends. Thank you, all of you. Millie, Vaishna, Disha, Shivansh. Thank you, guys. Millie. Thank you, Ashish Pita. Thank you, everybody.